Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 92. In 1981, we saw the publication of one of the most controversial books ever to be written about the Kennedy assassination. It was David Lifton's bestseller, Best Evidence, Disguise and Deception in the Assassination of John F. Kennedy. But let's rewind the tape for a minute. Late in 1964, just around the time that the Warren Commission report was published, Lifton, like so many Americans in this country, became interested in the JFK case. And wouldn't you know it, that happened after attending a lecture by Mark Lane on the topic of the Kennedy assassination and, of course, the related conspiracy to cover up the truth. Lifton was more than interested, and interested enough to purchase one of the 26-volume sets of the Warren Commission report. It wasn't long afterward when he started his own investigation and research into the Kennedy case. The quest was an all-consuming one in Lifton's life. In 1966, Lifton was dismissed from UCLA for neglecting his studies, and that was undoubtedly attributable to his increasing interest in the case. He quit his aerospace job, too, and for a time, Lifton began devoting all of his time to the Kennedy assassination. It was at UCLA that he began his interesting interaction with Warren Commission attorney Wesley Liebler. Lifton was not your average college student. He had already graduated from Cornell University's School of Engineering Physics in 1962, and he had made his way to the West Coast, enrolling at UCLA to work on an advanced degree in engineering. By January 1967, he had begun to get some traction in the assassination research community, and he presented a special report that he prepared along with David Welsh, which was featured in an issue of Ramparts magazine, and was entitled The Case for Three Assassins. This report laid out the scenario that more than one assassin was firing at Kennedy based on anomalies in the medical evidence. David Lifton spent 15 intense years studying the case from about 1966 to 1981, when he was finally able to publish Best Evidence. The book was rejected by over 20 publishers before Macmillan gave Lifton a $10,000 advance and published his book. Due to the controversial nature of the book, Macmillan went to unusual lengths to fact-check it. Best Evidence eventually reached number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was also a Book of the Month Club selection in 1990. Edwin McDowell of the New York Times described Best Evidence as, and I quote, one of the most durable of the dozens of books about the Kennedy assassination. Despite this fact, the distribution of the book was somewhat limited. Kent Carroll of Carroll and Graf Publishers reprinted a softcover version in 1988, and by 1990, the book had sold 60,000 copies that year. In the updated 1988 edition of Best Evidence, Lifton was responsible for the first publication of a series of autopsy photographs taken of President Kennedy at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. Lifton had acquired these photos after the initial publication of Best Evidence, and these were photos that he had obtained from a former Secret Service employee who had made private copies with the permission of Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman. Now, we all have to wonder how Roy Kellerman could have had authority to do that, but apparently he did. Lifton also used the autopsy photos during his appearance on the October 1988 PBS episode of Nova entitled Who Shot President Kennedy? This was the first time they were shown on television. Lifton claims that the actual photographs are consistent with his thesis of body alteration. Not everyone in the literary community was on board and okay with the introduction of these new theories surrounding the assassination, despite the meticulous work done by Lifton on the topic. Ed Magnuson of Time magazine described the theory as, and I quote, bizarre. But regardless, in his review, he wrote that Lifton's work was, and I quote, meticulously researched. According to Magnuson, preposterous, he questioned? Absolutely. Yet there is virtually no factual claim in Lifton's book that is not supported by the public record or his own interviews, many of them with the lowly hospital and military bystanders whom official probes had overlooked. Thomas Powers gave a critical review of the book in New York Magazine, stating, and I quote, "There are a lot of curious theories about what happened to John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, but none quite so bizarre as David Lifton's, a theory that makes all previous speculation about the president's murder look like the work of dull and sober men." Harrison Salisbury reviewed the book for the New York Times, and he wrote, "No one before Mr. Lifton has construed a theory so complicated, so quirky, and in such violation of every law of common sense and reason." And there were others, such as Stephen Ambrose, who discussed the book and wrote in 1992, "Mr. Lifton argues that the conspirators who killed Kennedy got possession of Kennedy's body somewhere between Dallas and Washington, then removed his brain and otherwise altered his body and wounds to support a single gunman theory. Mr. Lifton's account of how this was done is almost impossible to follow, almost impossible to believe, and almost impossible to refute." Well, to be honest with you, I have some of the same feelings about it all. Yet I continue to be drawn back to the meticulous facts that were preserved in his book, and do appear to be true. There are certainly no lack of big-time critics, and you've just heard a few. Another one, a big-time critic of the conspiracy theories in general, is author and lawyer Gerald Posner, who's described Lifton's book as one of the most unusual conspiracy theories that relies on an elaborate shell game involving rapid exchanges of coffins, a decoy ambulance, and a switched body shroud. He contends that once the body of President Kennedy was stolen from Air Force One, a covert team of surgeons surgically altered the corpse before the autopsy later that day, purportedly so the autopsy physicians would determine the bullets that hit the president were fired from the rear, thereby sealing the case against Oswald. Vincent Bugliosi also devoted some important time to this topic in his 2007 book, Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In fact, he dedicated 12 pages to Lifton's theory, and Bugliosi prefaced his own comments stating that the theory is so unhinged that it really doesn't deserve one word in any serious treatment of the assassination, but that he was forced to devote some time to talking about the nonsense of a most exquisite nature due to the number of people who treated it seriously. Well, really, there you have it. People may not like it, people may want to ignore it, but people keep having to come back to it because there is solid evidence that many parts of what we are studying in this episode are simply true. Yet it's really hard to put it all together. I could go on and on about the negative reviews of Best Evidence across the country in 1981, but still, other reviewers characterize Lifton's work as meticulously detailed, methodical, and well-documented, and, in the end, a challenge to the Warren Commission. Lifton captured many key witnesses on tape, both video and audio, and in fact, in the 1990s, those tapes were provided to the ARRB and were used in the interrogation of some of the key witnesses that were questioned under oath by the board. You may recall all of that from our earlier episodes. They were critical to getting at the truth with those particular witnesses. Lifton also put together a short 37-minute documentary that was also entitled Best Evidence, and much of it focuses on the evidence that points to a body snatch of the president and an ensuing pre-autopsy autopsy. And one of the linchpin elements that Lifton uses to prove his theory is that the president arrived at the Bethesda morgue in a plain shipping casket and not the ceremonial casket that he left Parkland Hospital in. Well, how could that be? Weren't members of the Irish Mafia and the Kennedy crew with the body all the way from Parkland to Bethesda? I can tell you that, to this day, I am a skeptic of this theory. But let's listen to David Lifton himself, along with several key witnesses that day at Bethesda, as they make the case for the president's arrival in a shipping casket and for other holes in the sequence of events and the events themselves that clearly point to the presence of a sinister act. So you, as the juror, will have to listen closely and determine if what you are hearing is real, because if it is real, well, I would just say, Houston, we have a problem. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 92 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Hello, I'm David Lifton. In 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated, I was a graduate student at UCLA and working nights on the Apollo space program. I admired President Kennedy a great deal and was proud to be part of his effort to put a man on the moon. In the fall of 1964, the special commission appointed by President Lyndon Johnson and headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren released a report of its findings on the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Report. I studied that report, focusing on an exhibit to be found in Volume 18, black and white frames of the home movie film taken by Abraham Zapruder, some of which were published in color in Life magazine. Those frames contained startling information. They showed that in response to the fatal shot, President Kennedy's head was thrust backwards, violently backwards. As a graduate of Cornell University with a degree in engineering physics, this backward motion seemed hard evidence to me that President Kennedy was shot from the front. And that wasn't the only evidence. 2/3 of the witnesses thought he'd been shot from the front. And most important of all, when the president was brought to Parkland Memorial Hospital minutes after the shooting, the doctors and nurses there thought he'd been shot from the front. The Warren Commission concluded otherwise, that the president was shot from behind. What about the head snap? It was never mentioned. What about the witnesses? They were wrong. They heard echoes. And what about the Dallas doctors? They too were simply wrong. But I couldn't accept this. It all seemed too improbable. And yet, a Warren Commission attorney told me that in order to believe that President Kennedy was shot from the front, you had to believe the 2 Navy autopsy doctors who had testified before the commission had lied under oath. That too seemed improbable. And so I struggled with a contradiction. Which evidence to believe? The Dallas evidence, which seemed to indicate that President Kennedy was struck from the front, or the government conclusion backed by the Bethesda autopsy that the president was struck from behind. Both couldn't be correct, or so it seemed. And then I thought of a possibility nobody had addressed, that nobody was lying, that everybody was telling the truth, but that somebody had altered the body. That's right, there had been surgery on the body prior to the autopsy, not clinical surgery to save the president's life, but post-mortem surgery to remove bullets and alter wounds. If true, the doctors didn't lie to the investigators, the body lied to the doctors. The body is evidence, the best evidence, and this post-mortem surgery is a crime. At the very least, it's an obstruction of justice. At worst, it's part of a conspiracy to take the president's life and then falsify the facts about his death. This illicit surgery is the central thesis of my book, Best Evidence. It took 15 years to research and write, and was published in January 1981. The film you're about to see was produced about 3 months earlier, in October 1980. Its purpose was to get the key witnesses on camera before they themselves realized the full implication of the information they possessed. The film deals with a single issue, the interception and the alteration of President Kennedy's body prior to autopsy. And the story begins in Dallas on November 22, 1963, at Parkland Memorial Hospital. At 1 p.m. in Parkland Hospital, President Kennedy was pronounced dead. His body was returned to Air Force One and flown to Washington. 6 hours after the shooting, an autopsy was performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital in the morgue of the U.S. Navy Medical School, where Dennis David was chief of the day. 17 years later, Dennis David, now a food company executive in Hoopeston, Illinois, is talking about what he saw that night.
Are you scared?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
I would have been, I know that for a number of years afterwards I was afraid to say anything about what I saw that night.
But you're telling me then that if I had had this conversation with you in 1964 or 5, and I told you this or showed you these pictures and we went into the implications of the sequence that you witnessed, that you would be more frightened?
In 1964 or 65, I wouldn't even have talked to you.
Dennis David is one of several people who are now talking to me about what they saw that day. I spoke with the funeral attendant who placed the president's body in its casket in Dallas, the Bethesda medical technician who removed the body from its casket in the autopsy room, and the X-ray technician who participated in the autopsy. What these men say now about what they saw then casts doubt on the official version of the events that day, because all these men provide new information about the most important evidence in the case, President Kennedy's body. In any shooting, the autopsy report, which describes the body, is used to determine the facts of the case. The Warren Commission, therefore, relied on the way the body looked at the time of the autopsy in Bethesda to reach its conclusions about what happened in Dallas. But the standard legal procedure didn't work this time. And in my book, Best Evidence, I explain why the autopsy failed to reveal the truth about Dallas. Between the Dallas shooting and the Bethesda autopsy, 6 hours later, President Kennedy's body was secretly removed from the casket. It was then surgically changed. Wounds were altered. Bullets were removed. The body was returned in time for the autopsy, returned as a medical forgery which told a false story of the shooting. And here is evidence that the body was indeed surgically changed. This is the FBI report written by the two agents who actually attended the autopsy. James Siebert and Francis O'Neill wrote that when the body was removed from the casket, it was, quote, apparent that a tracheotomy had been performed, as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. In fact, no surgery of the head was performed in Dallas, only a tracheotomy. So if this FBI report is correct, someone must have had access to the body before it reached Bethesda, and my witnesses indicate someone did. I've traced the journey of the body, beginning with Aubrey Reich. That afternoon, he worked for the O'Neill Funeral Home in Dallas. Now he's a sergeant with the Highland Park, Texas Police.
I helped put President Kennedy's body in a bronze ceremonial casket on November 22nd, 1963, at Parkland Memorial Hospital.
That evening at approximately 8 o'clock, the body arrived in a gray metal casket.
In Bethesda, Paul O'Connor was a medical technician who assisted the autopsy doctors. Today, he's a retired police officer and lives in Gainesville, Florida. When President Kennedy's body was brought to the morgue, what kind of casket was it in?
It was a typical, what I call a typical pinkish gray shipping casket. The type of casket that they usually ship bodies from one part of the country to the other. It was just a plain casket, I'd say cheap casket.
Could you please describe the coffin into which you put the body of the president?
It was a bronze metal coffin with it was a light bronze or a dark bronze coffin with lighter bronze handles on it. It was a very nice, expensive type casket.
It was a very plain casket, and when I say plain, I mean it was pinkish gray. It had pink and gray on the sides. There was nothing fancy about it as far as being bronze. It wasn't bronze.
About how much would you say it weighed?
I would venture to say it weighed close to 1,000 pounds.
About how much would you say it weighed?
Oh, with the body, maybe...
Well, without the body?
Oh, maybe 60 pounds.
Paul O'Connor's description of the casket brought to Bethesda was supported by Dennis David, who was there when the ambulance came in.
As I recall, it was a black unmarked ambulance. And we offloaded a casket, and it was carried into the autopsy room. This casket is a plain gray box, if you will, metal box. Anybody who's ever been in Vietnam would know what I'm talking about. We shipped hundreds of bodies out of there in the same type of casket. It's just a plain shipping casket.
In the picture here, you can tell this is not a shipping casket. A shipping casket would be what they'd ship a body back from, say, Vietnam in. This couldn't be a shipping casket. This is a high-class casket here.
That was Aubrey Reich, who was in Dallas. I showed the same picture to Dennis David. I'm showing you here some pictures taken at Love Field in Dallas, Texas. Was that the casket you saw taken in the back entrance from at the loading dock?
You're talking about the black ambulance?
Yeah, the black ambulance?
No. As I said, the one that we offloaded there was a standard government issue type plastic metal, a metal, gray metal box that obviously is a casket, but nothing, not with the side arms, the side rails, and all this, just handles on the side. Now, this wasn't the one that we offloaded.
Not only had the casket changed between Dallas and Bethesda, the wrapping around the body had changed too. According to the House Assassinations Committee, the body arrived at Bethesda in a body bag. That was not how it left Parkland Hospital.
They had him wrapped in sheets at the time. And when we picked him up to put him in there, he was still dripping quite a bit of blood from the wound in the back of his head, whatever caused it. We put some more sheets in a mattress liner, plastic mattress liner inside the coffin to soak up this blood that was dripping, you know. We went ahead and put him in the coffin and closed the lid.
Paul O'Connor describes the scene at Bethesda.
We opened the whole casket up, and there was a gray body bag, zipped shut. We unzipped the body bag, and the president's body was lifted out of the body bag. He's completely naked except for a sheet wrapped around his head, a bloody sheet.
Now, when you put the president's body into the coffin, did you put the president's body into a body bag?
No, sir.
Paul, most people don't know what a body bag is, so I happen to get one, and I'd like to know if this is the kind of, this is a...
Typically, this is it. This is maybe not the model that we use, but as you see, it's got the zipper on it. It's heavy plastic, gauge plastic, and typical body bag.
This is a typical body bag.
Typical body bag.
Is this the kind of, basically, these...
Basically, this is the way it looked.
Aubrey, does this bear any resemblance to the mattress cover you used to line the coffin to keep the blood away from the bottom of the coffin?
No, sir. This one doesn't, no.
What is this?
This is what we call a crash bag, or a body bag, you could call it. We call them crash bags.
And mattress cover wouldn't look like this at all?
No, sir. It was a plastic,
yeah,
similar to this, but mattress cover has no zipper.
And you didn't use a body bag for the president?
No, sir. No way.
Absolutely no question about that?
No way.
How can you be certain?
I was there.
And you remember?
I remember picking him up. I was the one that had the blood on my shirt and everything from the body. If he'd been in a crash bag, you couldn't have got any blood on him because it's a sealed bag.
I told Reich about Paul O'Connor's account of opening a body bag.
Top to the bottom, and he had to unzip the zipper.
He didn't get one from us.
I've interviewed the people in Dallas who put the president's body inside the casket in Dallas. There was no body bag used. For your information, those people...
That sounds strange.
That sounds what?
Sounds strange to me.
Is there any possibility you're confused that it was anything but a body bag? Could you...
Well, a body bag, a mattress cover, if that's what they said they used, does not have a zipper down the middle of it.
Paul, they said they didn't use anything. They did not use a mattress cover. They said a mattress cover was used to keep blood off the bottom, but they didn't put him inside anything.
Well, between Parkland and Bethesda, he was placed in a body bag.
This is one of the most unique and tragic moments in the history of Andrews Air Force Base.
The casket was different and the wrapping was different. But how could anything have been secretly changed? Wasn't Mrs. Kennedy always with the casket? She was, but unknown to her, the body was elsewhere. It did not arrive in the gray Navy ambulance that took Mrs. Kennedy and the ceremonial casket to Bethesda.
Now the ramp is being slowly lowered to the ground, containing the casket. And a gray U.S. Navy ambulance has pulled into sight and is now directly in front of the ramp in which the casket still rests.
Dennis, after all these years, how can you be certain the vehicle at the back was black?
Well, that's one of the things I remembered, because Navy ambulances or military ambulances traditionally are gray. And I remember that night that it was black because it wasn't gray.
Because it wasn't a military...
It wasn't a military vehicle.
Was it normal for non-military vehicles to put the loading dock?
No, not normally.
Dennis David was at the back of the hospital. He is one of several people whose accounts establish that the body arrived at the back before the Navy ambulance with the large Dallas casket arrived at the front.
After we offloaded and they took the casket, which we understood that had President Kennedy's body in it, I went back up front again to check my men on post.
While at the front, he witnessed the arrival of two more caskets. First, a second shipping casket was offloaded from a helicopter. It's not clear what role this casket plays. Then he saw the large Dallas casket arrive in the gray Navy ambulance from Andrews.
I was on the rotunda on the second floor looking out. I saw a helicopter land, and I saw again another casket, the shipping type, which was similar to the one we just offloaded, being offloaded off a helicopter. And then the motorcade pulled up in front, and I went back out in the passageway and was standing on the rotunda looking down into the foyer of the Naval Medical Center when Mrs. Kennedy, or Jacqueline Kennedy, came in.
No, you actually saw Jackie arrive at Bethesda?
Yes, I did. Later on, a bunch of us were working that night, we were talking about 2 caskets. I said something about it, and somebody said, well, there was another one on the gray ambulance that came in front of the entourage, and we couldn't figure out which casket had President Kennedy's body in, and some of the boys that were in the autopsy room said, well, he was in the first one, and that the other 2 were fakes. I don't know officially why there were 3 ambulances, but security was one of the rumors, or one of the things that was speculated about.
Dennis David didn't find it peculiar, but he saw the Navy ambulance arrive after a shipping casket was brought to the morgue. If he's right, then the body was at Bethesda before Jacqueline Kennedy. He's supported by Gerald Custer, the X-ray technician, now an X-ray technician in Pittsburgh. Custer says he was carrying autopsy X-rays to be developed when he saw Mrs. Kennedy arrive.
When you encountered Jacqueline Kennedy, when you saw her in the lobby, had you already taken any X-rays?
Well, we had an armful at the time, and my apron or gown that I had on was bloody.
I want you to know, I would like to ask you how you react to the fact that if you already had the X-rays in your hand, the body was already in the morgue when she walked in the door, and yet she just got out of the ambulance containing the casket. How firm are you in your recollection that you saw Jackie when you already had taken X-rays? Is that without question, or would you say that you might waver on that?
No, because I'm almost assured I had X-rays in my arm at the time when I saw her. We had just finished taking some X-rays.
That would mean that the casket in the ambulance parked right outside is empty.
That would have to be it, because we had just left the morgue, and I'm sure that we took X-rays. I know we did, because we had a security man with us at the time.
Dennis, is it possible you're wrong about the sequence? That in order to...
The sequence is crucial. If the body was in the morgue before Jacqueline and the gray Navy ambulance arrived, then Jacqueline Kennedy was with an empty casket.
But that you're wrong about the sequence. That what really happened is that first you saw Jackie come in the front, and then you went around back and saw a black vehicle arrive at the loading dock.
No way. I remember that vividly. The ambulance, and we offloaded a casket at the back of the hospital a good 15 or 20 minutes before Jackie Kennedy came in.
Dennis David and Gerald Custer both indicate that the body was already in the Bethesda morgue when Jacqueline Kennedy arrived. I've also spoken to others in Bethesda that night. They didn't know about the sequence, but they did talk of 2 ambulances. The explanation was always the same: security. Some called it the decoy ambulance. One said it was Navy strategy. But a key authority denies that these security measures were taken. In July 1980, I had a 2.5-hour tape-recorded interview with General Chester Clifton, which I report at length in Best Evidence. General Clifton was the senior military aide to President Kennedy. He was aboard Air Force One and made arrangements by radio for the autopsy. Clifton insisted there was no decoy ambulance, that no special security arrangements were made. The FBI didn't know about any security arrangements either.
I want to tell you that the FBI filed a report, and they had 2 agents go out to meet the plane. 2 agents went out to meet the plane and to attend the autopsy. And those 2 agents talk about how they followed the Navy ambulance. They were part of the motorcade, that Jackie got into the ambulance, and they followed that motorcade containing the ambulance to Bethesda. Now, we've talked, and you've told me, and we know from your conclusions that the coffin in that ambulance is empty.
Right.
Do you think it's strange that you knew about something that apparently was unknown to the FBI that day? That you know that the coffin in there is empty? The FBI didn't know.
How do I know the FBI didn't know that it was empty?
They give no indication.
Yeah.
Well, they give no indication, and Jacqueline Kennedy is kind of grief-struck as she watches her husband's body being put into the ambulance. Do you think she knows that the box is empty? We've all seen pictures of Jackie at Andrews. How do you explain it?
I wouldn't have any idea, but all I know is, what I know, that was a gray, that we offloaded a gray, unmarked box shipping casket that later, I was told, contained the body of the president, and that the other ones were for security purposes, that they were fakes or empty. Now, you know, we covered earlier what the purposes for there. I don't know. There could be a lot of speculation as to why.
But there can be no speculation about the facts. 2 ambulances, 2 caskets, different wrappings on the body, security measures unknown to the president's chief military aide and to the FBI. It indicates that someone had access to the body. And the most blatant evidence that someone changed the body is that it left Dallas with a small wound in the back of the head, about the size of an egg, and arrived at Bethesda with a wound 4 times as large. It left Dallas with a brain, and the Bethesda autopsy reports on a brain presumably removed from the president's cranium. Yet 2 of my witnesses say that when the body arrived, the cranium was empty. Again, Paul O'Connor, the Bethesda medical technician.
In that particular case, there was no brain to be removed. It was all blown out.
Okay.
It was gone. Most of the cranium was empty except for a few pieces of brain matter.
Gerald Custer, the Bethesda X-ray technician.
I could fit both of my hands right inside the skull cavity. And like I had mentioned, that I brought my hands back and there were still little pieces of brain cells that I had to take off my hands. And there was still blood on it.
At one point you actually did?
Yeah, I put my hands right inside the skull. And I made the comment to Reed, my God, look at the size of this hole.
The doctors were right there. Did you have the responsibility for telling them that the cranium was empty?
Oh, no, sir. Everybody looked, as I recollect, when we got the last part of the sheet off, there was just a gasp through the room, and I looked down and I said to myself, my God, there's no brain. It's all gone.
What did anybody else say? Did you hear any comments from the others?
Well, there was a lot of mumbling and talking and everything, but I wasn't even paying attention to that. I was kind of wrapped up in my own thoughts about how massive the wound was and how bad it was, and the fact that there was no brains.
And you didn't hear anybody else talking about it, or?
Oh, I can't recollect anybody saying anything specific.
I see. So, as a result of the cranium being empty, you didn't have to do the procedure to take out the brain?
No, sir. No.
Okay. When the Warren report came out in 1964, or ever since then, when did you first realize that there was a supplementary autopsy report on a brain that's reported to weigh about 1,400 grams, almost a complete brain?
Well, I don't know where they got it from. It surely wasn't the president's.
Did anybody say anything about there being no brain in the...
Well, the comment was made that the brain was removed. But to my best knowledge, I don't remember seeing any saw cuts or any knife cuts. But it's not saying that it couldn't have been removed.
Did you question the purpose of the x-rays you were taking?
Yes, I asked, I said, what's the sense of taking the x-rays if there's nothing there? He said, well, that's not for you to say. You go ahead and do them.
Another irregularity in the autopsy, I got to say, is that you know that the president's cranium was empty.
Yes.
At Bethesda.
Mostly empty. I'd say 90% empty, yes.
At Dallas, it wasn't empty. There was a small egg-sized wound at the right rear of the head, about the size of an egg. 2 3/4 inches is the measurements given by the Dallas doctors in sworn testimony, and that's it, 2 3/4 inch. The wound at Bethesda is 4 times larger.
Oh, at least.
Were you aware of that before?
No, I wasn't. That's strange. As I said, when he was brought out of the casket, he did have that massive head wound. Unless at Parkland they decided to do a partial craniotomy, and then again they opened the brain. It was jagged opening all the way through the head.
Yes. What's a craniotomy for the lay audience?
Well, craniotomy is an operation, a brain operation, where they bore holes in the brain and the cranium to get to the brain.
Right. Would that also be called in plain English surgery?
Yes, sir.
Surgery. What made the FBI agents write that there had been surgery of the head area? In 1966, I called James Siebert, one of the 2 authors of the report. He refused to answer my question. He only said, the report stands. I wrote the FBI asking the same question and received a routine reply. But in 1977, under the Freedom of Information Act, I found this 1966 memo from Assistant Director Alex Rosen to Assistant Director Cartha Deloche about my call and letter. The memo focused on the surgery statement. It referred to the report as, quote, information orally furnished by the autopsy physician. I found other memos indicating the same thing. The FBI position boils down to this. Our agents wrote it because they heard it from a doctor. Surgery. Is the major thesis of my book correct? Did someone get access to the body and surgically change the body between the Dallas shooting and the Bethesda autopsy? Consider the pattern of contradictions. The body left Dallas with a small head wound, about 35 square centimeters, and arrived in Bethesda with a wound 4 times as large, about 170 square centimeters. The body left Dallas with a brain and arrived in Bethesda without a brain. The body left Dallas wrapped in sheets and arrived in Bethesda in a zippered body bag. The body left Dallas in a ceremonial casket and arrived in Bethesda in a cheap shipping casket. The pattern is clear. What these witnesses say cannot be ignored.
I know. I was there. I saw it. There's no doubt in my mind. Now, what their reasons for not saying this now, I don't know. I can't crawl inside their head to find out. But I know that there were 2 caskets. And I know that the first casket we offloaded that we later were told was the one with Kennedy was a shipping casket. It was not the formal casket that you showed me in these pictures earlier. Why people persist, that's what I don't understand. Why can't they bring this stuff out? Why can't they make it public to the people and let the people see it? Why they have to hide it? I don't understand it. Even 20 years later, I don't understand it.
A great many people don't understand why we don't have the truth about this whole affair. One reason is the military order not to talk. The Navy kept track of everyone in the morgue that night, and everyone who was there, like X-ray technician Gerald Custer, like medical technician Paul O'Connor, were ordered not to talk about what they'd seen or heard. It was a written order. Each man had to sign it. The penalty for disobedience, court-martial. To a man, they obeyed it. For 10 years, Custer was afraid to tell his wife that he had taken Kennedy's X-rays. This order was rescinded in 1978. You've just seen the first filmed interviews with these important witnesses. In fact, none of them testified before either major investigation into the assassination, neither the Warren Commission in 1964 or the House Select Committee in 1978. Another obstacle to the truth has been the autopsy photographs. Normally, such pictures are an integral part of a homicide investigation, but not in this case. Because of the reluctance of the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, and objections from the Kennedy family, this material was not used as evidence. Instead, 3 schematic drawings were used, and the testimony of the Navy autopsy doctors was accepted without authentication. In one of the most important homicide investigations ever conducted, critical facts turned on one man's word about what another man's body looked like. The testimony of the Navy autopsy doctor was considered the best evidence. By 1976, when the second investigation began, the matter of the autopsy photographs again came up. The House Select Committee demanded access. Again, the Kennedy family resisted. A compromise was struck. A panel of experts examined the photographs, but as far as the public was concerned, 3 drawings were used. The second investigation also concluded the president was struck twice from behind, but unlike the Warren Commission, their conclusion was based on the autopsy photographs, now considered to be the best evidence. But are they? The committee's expert panel says they're authentic, yet one of the committee's own consultants alleges they're forgeries. Can we trust this evidence and what the experts have told us? Why can't we see the evidence ourselves? In 1982, I obtained copies. The source was a former Secret Service official. When I first saw them, I thought they should never be published, out of respect for the Kennedy family. However, they are crucial evidence in this case, and the issue of respect for the living is in conflict with justice for the dead. I believe the American people have a right to see what is now considered the best evidence. In 1988, I published these pictures in the new edition of my book, making them available to the public for the first time. These pictures contradict both the descriptions of the Dallas doctors and the Bethesda autopsy report. For example, here's the picture of the back of President Kennedy's head. In Dallas, there was a wound there. The Bethesda autopsy report describes an even bigger hole. But in this photograph, the official autopsy photo, there's no hole at all. So where is this wound? Actually, according to the autopsy photographs, it's at the top of the head. But in the autopsy x-ray, why there, it's at the front of the head. Thus, the autopsy photographs contradict not only what was seen in Dallas, but also what was seen at Bethesda, as well as the x-ray that was supposedly taken at Bethesda. Thus, the issue of authenticity applies not only to the president's body, but to the x-rays and photographs of the body as well. A final point, and another reason why we haven't gotten to the truth: public misunderstanding. Many people don't understand how the investigations functioned in the first place. They think the whole government would have to be involved if there was a plot. That, of course, is not the case. I don't believe the FBI or the Warren Commission found the truth and then covered it up. The problem is the crime was never solved in the first place. The whole issue of body alteration just never came up. The altered body falsely linked the gun found in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building with the crime that took place on the street below, making it appear in the evidence that President Kennedy was shot by one man firing from behind, by Lee Harvey Oswald, making it appear that the assassination was a quirk of fate, that a lone malcontent hiding in a warehouse murdered the President of the United States. The Warren Commission accepted this story and passed it on to the American public and to history, that a man in a building shot a man in a car. However, if the body was altered, that story is false, and President Kennedy was removed from office as a result of a covert operation. Who's responsible? I don't know who altered the body, but I do know who had the body. The U.S. government had the body. The body was always in the custody of a group of Secret Service agents and a Navy Rear Admiral. Consequently, if it was a covert operation, it had to be a domestic covert operation. What can be done about this? In light of this new evidence, a third national investigation is warranted, focused on the autopsy, focused on the chain of possession of the body. It may be too late for justice in this case, but it's never too late for the truth. And the truth in this case can only be found by directing the proper questions to the proper witnesses under oath. Otherwise, we have to accept the fact that on November 22, 1963, America had a secret election.
Thank you for listening to episode 92 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK, The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 93. Think back a little bit. We've been wandering around in the autopsy for maybe 25 or 30 episodes now, and to be honest with you, I'm getting fatigued with the topic. I said it before to you, and I knew this would be the case. But the truth is, I knew this would be one of the most important, if not the most important elements to address when developing this podcast and telling the story of the JFK assassination. I also knew how complicated it was and how fraught with secrecy, misinformation, and errors. Errors that had come with the passage of time and the coincident silence, as well as the lies that accrue after narratives are deliberately formulated and changed for whatever reason, and then repeated over and over and over again during that same time frame. In short, it was like entering a maze. I wasn't sure that if we entered that maze that we'd ever get out of it. Well, the answer is we will get out of it, eventually. But not quite yet, because there's still some unfinished business. I'm not promising any more exactly when we're leaving this topic, because to get to the other end of this maze, like I said, we still have to cover a few more important matters. At the end of the last episode, you heard the one private researcher, David Lifton, the one that did the trailblazing work around the idea that President Kennedy's body was snatched and placed into an alternative casket, and then at some point, the body itself was subjected to some form of surgery or alteration prior to the actual autopsy taking place. And these facts could only have been perpetrated by an element of our government, because President Kennedy's body was only in the hands of the government during the critical time frames that are in question. The real issue here is that there is no clear, hard evidence of specific actions. Specific actions, that is, to alter the body. No one testified that they did that, or that they watched it occur, or that they even heard that it had occurred. Again, no one testified that it actually happened. Well, that's not quite true, but I'll get to that soon enough. There are still a handful of highly credible witnesses that we have to hear from, and a few stories in between as well. Well, that are facts which are clearly stranger than fiction. The first of those witnesses is the primary subject of today's episode, and actually the subject of a series of episodes that we will now undertake. The witness is James Jenkins. Of all the men present that night, James Jenkins was clearly one of the most credible and capable, and outside of the doctors themselves, he was one of the men who saw the most and did the most during the course of the autopsy. He was one of the few who, afterward, truly went out of his way to avoid the limelight of the assassination story. First, because he was a good military man, and he followed orders, and he was genuinely worried that not following them would result in the court-martial that the military had so clearly laid out for those who dared talk about it. We know from our previous episodes that those secrecy orders eventually expired and were officially lifted around the 1978 time frame, right around the time that the House Select Committee on Assassinations began its investigation. Slowly, over time, many of the witnesses began to open up about what happened. That is, about what really happened and what took place that night at Bethesda. Jenkins was like a crustacean, hiding from prey deep underwater. This kind, soft, gentle man would occasionally leave the protective bubble that he had made for himself, that bubble that shielded him in his own life from really the dangers that were certainly inherent in being a central character in this part of the passion play that was the JFK assassination. Over his lifetime, Jenkins would occasionally give in to the exhortations of a JFK researcher and make comment or answer a question, only to retreat after the recipient researcher twisted Jenkins' words or took something out of context or otherwise did something to betray the trust of this humble man. It was very late in life before James Jenkins actually made a personal decision to write a book about all of this, and it would come about nearly 50 years past the assassination. He did it because his wife urged him to do it. Had it been for other reasons, that is, primarily economics, it would have been done long before. Jenkins always knew how important this topic was to the history of this country. History that was, and still is, a critical input into understanding just who we are as a nation and who we were at that moment in time in 1963. There really was only one researcher over the years who gained the trust of James Jenkins, and his name is William Matson Law. He's a fine JFK researcher who eventually wrote the book In the Eye of History. It's an excellent rendering of many things, including his articulation of aspects of the James Jenkins story. William Matson Law eventually went on to help James Jenkins write his own whole story on the event, a book that Jenkins wrote primarily by himself and was entitled At the Cold Shoulder of History. Not only does that book tell the story of that night at Bethesda in more detail, but it also gives a sense of who James Jenkins was in life, and you get a real sense of this man's character and background. I think it mirrors what you will feel when you listen to his voice later in this episode. It's a wonderful book, and I've drawn from some of its chapters today as well. No discussion on this topic can be complete, though, without citing the wonderful work of Doug Horne in his series of books entitled Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. Mr. Horne has also done many related articles. Horne has done a marvelous job in synthesizing not only what key witnesses said, but what became known within the Assassination Records Review Board about these topics after the totality of the hearings that they conducted, and that he was an integral part of. And just remember, so many of those hearings and topics you heard right here on previous episodes of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Over the course of the next several episodes, we will read and quote extensively from Horn's work. Regardless, we owe a tremendous debt in this country and indeed on this podcast to David Lifton. It is true that in listening to David Lifton, I have advised you on multiple occasions that I was not personally in agreement with the idea that there was evidence of additional surgery or alteration of the president's body. But I hope I was careful enough to say that there was no evidence of it. That's different than saying that all roads point to Rome. What do I mean by this? Well, it's very simple. There is very credible evidence indicating that something very wrong went on here. Let's start with the fact that the president arrived in a shipping casket, and he did not arrive in the ceremonial bronze casket in which he was initially placed into at Parkland. The evidence to me is clear that this happened. Why would the government do that? Maybe if it was for some good reason, perhaps security concerns around the body, then why haven't they admitted to that? Look, it might have been an odd admission in retrospect, as the idea of someone desecrating the president's body in the aftermath was, well, let's face it, highly unlikely. But the point is that when the president showed up in an alternative casket, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that something more was going on. Period. In my opinion, that is unequivocally the case. So let me restate and be very clear. The conspiracy theorists believe that the body was snatched at some point, then placed in a regular shipping casket, and at still another point, additional procedures were applied to President Kennedy's body in order to obscure the forensic evidence and to ensure that there was only one conclusion that could come from what was left. And that conclusion would have to be that there was a lone gunman firing from somewhere up around the 6th floor of the school book depository, and therefore it was reaffirmation that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman and the lone assassin of JFK. Let me be clear here. I think there is clear evidence that the president did arrive in a plain shipping casket. And that is the focus of today's episode and several episodes that continue this wander into the topic. Where the problems start and end is that there is no real credible evidence that surgical alterations took place. You will hear some testimony from other witnesses, from others besides James Jenkins, that might support that theory. That is, that there was some sort of surgery applied to the head. Jenkins will tell you that he was there with the body most of the time, and he saw no such evidence of that, at least not while he was there. There are some gaps in time, though, and we will address them. You'll hear another witness today in some of the audio. Hubert Clark was a member of the original honor guard that was assigned to carry the casket and deliver it from Air Force One to Bethesda. From him, you will hear the astonishing fact that the entire honor guard shortly after that night at Bethesda, well, every one of them got new orders and were, out of the blue, suddenly shipped out to various locations across the globe, scattered to the wind with the obvious implication that they would not get a chance to talk amongst each other about what they had experienced and seen that night at Bethesda, or what any of them could potentially have suspected. Statistically, what were the chances that those men might all randomly be reassigned right at the moment just after this frighteningly sober event occurred and gotten orders prior to the scheduled termination of each of their existing current assignments to go halfway around the globe? If you're a betting man, you can see what the odds are here. This might be the one that you would concede and conclude, like I have, that something was rotten in Denmark on that one. Well, there is lots more to come here about the shipping casket and more to hear directly from James Jenkins and Hubert Clark on the goings-on that night. But we must understand that the more from Jenkins is, well, precious more. He gave up very little to the public in 50 years, and in 2013, the year that marked the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, he would finally decide to be more in the public and attend the JFK Lancer Conference, a popular conference for those seeking the truth about the JFK assassination. That would be a start of a trail of evidence from James Jenkins that would eventually lead to what you are going to hear today. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 93 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. The evidence for 2 ambulances and 2 caskets will not go away. Military chatter aboard Air Force One made repeated reference to the need for a forklift to be brought to the right front of the plane, where the First Lady would depart. But Mrs. Kennedy left the plane with everyone else from the left rear. For those of you who follow this part of the assassination story, you know there is no footage of anything happening on the right side of the plane. Whatever did happen likely did not see the light of day. That's essentially the side of the plane which would have been behind where the passengers were exiting. More stunning was the HSCA's suppressed interview with Richard Lipsey, the military aide put in charge of moving the body from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda. In 1978, Lipsey told HSCA interviewers that there had been 2 hearses and 2 caskets. You heard Lipsey's testimony on a previous episode of our podcast. According to Lipsey, Jackie Kennedy accompanied an empty casket into the front of the hospital, while the one with the body in it went around to the back, where the morgue was. The House Select Committee on Assassinations made virtually no effort to follow up on this explosive story. It was not until the Assassination Records Review Board was born that the theory and the story would get serious legs inside of an official investigative body. Well, the years continued to go by, and it was now Thursday, November 21st, 2013, and Doug Horn noticed a tall, reserved, dignified, and almost shy man standing in the lobby of the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas, where the JFK Lancer Conference was being held to commemorate the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination. The man that Horn had spotted was well over 6 feet tall, wore glasses, had white hair, and sported a well-trimmed, short white beard that was impeccably groomed. And to Horn, this man had an air of quiet and seriousness about him that took Horn for a pause. Horn knew immediately who it was. James Curtis Jenkins, one of the 2 Navy corpsmen who served as autopsy technicians and assisted the Navy pathologists, Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell, at President Kennedy's autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital on the evening of November 22, 1963. It was now 50 years later, and Horn was pleased to see Mr. Jenkins alive and looking so good, and yet surprised to see him attending a JFK research conference. Horn introduced himself and found that he was attending the conference with William Matson Law, one of the very few people in the JFK research community that James Jenkins trusts. William Law interviewed many of the autopsy witnesses and published his oral history of their interviews in the Eye of History. James Jenkins had a reputation for being reticent to discuss the JFK autopsy, and with good reason. He did not have a good experience when interviewed by 2 hostile and disbelieving HSCA staff members, and so he didn't trust any federal authorities, particularly because of what he himself witnessed at President Kennedy's autopsy. He did not concur with the Warren Commission's conclusions about a lone gunman firing from behind and no shots hitting JFK from the right front. That was a dog that didn't hunt with Jenkins. After the HSCA published its own report in 1979, confirming the Warren Commission's conclusions that Lee Harvey Oswald had done all the wounding of the limousine's occupants with shots from above and behind, he was even less well-disposed toward the organs of authority in this country. Over the years, Since the HSCA's report was issued in 1979, James Jenkins had agreed to appear on video before 3 different researcher-organized panels consisting largely of Navy autopsy witnesses. But none of that footage had yet been aired in the format of a completed documentary. Horn had seen some of the raw footage from one of those interviews in which Mr. Jenkins was interviewed along with Paul O'Connor, the other technician present that night, along with some of the Parkland treatment staff, including Dr. Robert McClellan. And as a result, Horn knew that Mr. Jenkins had significant things to say about what transpired at Bethesda that night. After reviewing the footage, Horn would conclude that Jenkins was credible and responsible. Horn would go on to speak with Jenkins that day, and Jenkins would tell him that he was not seeking any notoriety at all, and that his sole wish was to sit quietly in the back of the room at selected presentations and just take it all in and observe. Horn honored his request and did not reveal that he was present. But James Jenkins at the conference was big news. On the afternoon of the actual 50th anniversary, William Law moderated a breakout event called Special Guest Jim Jenkins. As it turned out, James Jenkins began to open up at this session and had quite a lot to say about his recollections of the autopsy. And the audience was so interested in what he had to say that a special session was organized for later that night, in which Mr. Jenkins continued to discuss his recollections of JFK's autopsy. Unfortunately, neither of the 2 sessions were taped or otherwise recorded. But, fortunately for history, Dr. David Mantic, an MD and a PhD, attended both sessions at which Jenkins spoke, and he took copious notes, something he has been known for decades, whenever an autopsy participant takes the floor. You've heard me reference Dr. Mantic's work in prior podcast episodes. Those notes then became the basis for some of Doug Horn's work on the topic, some of which you'll hear later in these episodes. Then, in 2018, some 5 years later, Jenkins would again be in attendance and give his eyewitness account along with Hubert Clark at one of the breakout sessions at the JFK Assassination Conference. Fortunately, 5 years after that seminal participation at the JFK Lancer Conference, the main session, now featuring Jenkins, was being recorded for history's sake. And that means you'll get a chance to hear James Jenkins and Hubert Clark tell their story of what happened that night in their own words. It will take us several episodes to wander through what Jenkins has to say, but it's well worth it. The third voice you'll hear is that of William Matson Law, the JFK researcher who established a long and trusting relationship with James Jenkins, and who accompanied them on the dais that day as a speaker. Let's begin listening now.
The name of this presentation is What Really Happened at the Autopsy. So tell us, Jim, what really happened?
No. Let you read.
You can tell your story.
Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge all the veterans in the room. I still have it. And for those of you that have bone spurs, we'll save that for another day. But on this auspicious occasion, as William has stated to you, the first time I met William and Phil Singer, who collaborated together to bring us together after 51 years of not having spoken to any of the other members of the casket team, my whole outlook on this Kennedy assassination was birthed to me by the government. I believed everything that the government had told us. And just so you know, that in my time in Washington, I probably have buried at least 350 individuals at Arlington National Cemetery. And for the most part, or being more specific, President Kennedy was my last funeral. And the very next day after we buried President Kennedy, I was awakened at 5:30 in the morning and was told to pack up, you're leaving. And I stated, well, it's not my time yet. They said, no, you're out of here. Unbeknownst to me at the time was that the other members of the casket team were also awakened at that same hour and was told to pack up. I got shipped off to Europe. Others got shipped off to Asia. Others went to Africa. Others went to 4 winds around the world. And it wasn't until these gentlemen brought us together after 51 years. And that's where the story begins. Because what we believed at the time that had taken place at Andrews Air Force Base, at Bethesda Naval Hospital, at the White House, at St. Matthew's Cathedral, and then to Arlington National Cemetery really didn't happen the way the government had told the American people and told us at the same time. And that's why when William asked me to do this book with him, the name of the book is Betrayal. And if you purchase it along with Jim's book, you will receive an autographed photo of the casket team of the last journey up to the gravesite of President John F. Kennedy. That's part of the carrot, so to speak. But as William stated, the way this odyssey happened, it started at Andrews Air Force Base when we were told that there were 2 teams, that our responsibility was to remove the remains from the elevated truck when it came down. And as you remember in the photos that you observed, as we proceeded to take the remains off the elevated truck, we were mugged, literally, by Secret Service agents, by FBI agents, and it wasn't until 51 years later that we understood why. They didn't want us to touch that casket because at that time, and there's no doubt in my mind or other members of the casket team's mind, that the casket was empty. And if we had allowed that to take place the way it did, when we handed over the casket or when it was taken from us at Andrews Air Force Base, we let go and the casket dropped and almost hit the tarmac, as you see in the photographs. And if that had happened, we would not be sitting here today because we would have known that the casket was empty. But it wasn't again known to us until 51 years later, because we shadowed the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Naval Hospital. It never stopped. Once we got to Bethesda Naval Hospital, we chased the ambulance around the grounds 3 times until we finally caught up with it at the loading dock of the administration building adjacent to the morgue. And again, we know it was the same casket because it had a dent in the top and the handle on the right-hand side. But as Jim later pointed out, God bless his heart, that while we were in the air shadowing the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base, the president was already on the autopsy table and we hadn't even landed yet. So I'm going to leave it right there and allow Jim, and later on you'll be able to ask me any question you want. And the things that I don't know, I will tell you. But I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here to tell you an eyewitness account of what took place over those 4 days. What you believe is on you. I'm telling you not just my story, but of the casket team's story. It's not that we collaborated together because we hadn't seen each other in 51 years. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason to be awakened at 5:30 in the morning and told to pack up. And never having the opportunity to say goodbye, to say, what experience did you have during those 4 days? They wanted to split us up so we would not have an opportunity to discuss what had taken place. And understand this, when you're in the military, people will ask me, and I'm sure there are people in this audience that will say, well, didn't you see this? Or didn't you look over here and see that? You need to understand, and those of you that have been in the military know that when you're in formation, you're looking straight ahead. You're looking at the back of the guy's head in front of you. So just to stop you from asking me that question, did I see this? I'm telling you what I observed, and I also want you to understand that as an 18-year-old individual that had to be signed into the military by his father under false pretenses, my story, the casket team story, we never got together, we never talked for 51 years until we had the reunion, and that's when Jim shattered our dream of what we thought was our service to the country and to our commander-in-chief. And when you read in the book, you will start to see how not just ourselves, but General Godfrey McHugh, who was the Air Force Chief of Staff to President Kennedy, it's understandable why now I understood what he meant when we took the bronze casket off the elevated truck. He shoved us aside, but in shoving us aside, he made a statement. And I remember like it was yesterday. His statement was, "This is my commander-in-chief, not that MF. This is my commander-in-chief." And I will explain to you during the Q&A what he meant by that. Jim?
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm responsible for Hubie's shocking moments. Basically, William and I recently completed a book. The book is my memories of what I participate in, what I actually did at the autopsy. And I was one of two assistants. Paul O'Connor was the other one. And Paul and I were called about 3:30 in the afternoon. We were told that the president had been had actually been shot, and that he had died. And that we were to report to the morgue, because Paul and I had the duty, and prepare the morgue in case the president's body was sent to us for autopsy. This was, at that time, it was just kind of a precautionary type thing. Paul and I went to the morgue. We opened the morgue, went in somewhere between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. And we began to prepare for an autopsy, a routine autopsy, which we did every duty night. And we were probably in there an hour or so, I'm sure. And then Dr. Boswell, I believe it was, came in and said that we were going to get the president's body for autopsy. we changed our routines to the fact is that normally we would label our specimen jars that we took tissue samples from microscopic and placed them in the jars. We would put the name, the tissue, and the autopsy number on it. And the autopsy number was something that was pre-printed in the log, but we had a stamp that sequenced the same number, I believe 3 or 5 times. And we used that to stamp toe tags, identifying paperwork that came to us. Most of our autopsies were brought from the hospital itself, so we had paperwork with it, and we stamped that with the autopsy number. But we were told to remove the labels with the names, with the president's name on it, and only use the autopsy number for identification. We were also told not to log the body into the morgue log. This was unusual. In the military, everything is specific, and it's actually done that way or you suffer consequences. And at that point in time, Paul and I prepared for the autopsy. We put out the instrumentation, prepared the solutions and so forth, what we call the bucket brain, our brain bucket. We put formalin in it and placed the gauze sling over the top of it. Approximately, now, I would like to say this. I was in that morgue from 3 o'clock to approximately 8:30, 9 o'clock the next day. I never looked at a clock. What I had to do was fairly intense. I had to listen to the pathologist. I had to do what they asked and observe what they were doing. And so I stood at the right shoulder of the president's body almost all night. And the body came in approximately at 6:30. Now, that time frame, I had to have a timeline in writing the book. The time frame I took from Dennis David. I took that time frame as opposed to other time frames that exist out there that came from government sources, from other individuals and so forth. But I chose this one because it was the most realistic to me. Plus, it was collaborated by Sergeant Boyden, who was in charge of the Marine security detail there, and that's the time that he filed his action report to his superiors. And then several years ago, we were contacted by an individual, Dr. J. Scott, who told us that, and he was an orthopedist, he said that he was doing a residency at Bethesda during the time that the autopsy was done, and he happened to be the officer of the day for the hospital. Now, to explain this, there were actually 2 commands at Bethesda. One was the hospital command under Captain Canada. The other one was the medical school underneath Captain Stover. My command was the medical school, and we were responsible. Actually, the laboratory, the pathologist, the school, and so forth were all under the command of Captain Stover. So we had a separate officer of the day. We had a separate NCO. Dennis David was basically that non-commissioned officer that was in charge that night. And Dennis was the one that was told to put together a detail to unload the casket. Now, I think that order was actually a misstep because of miscommunications, because I think that was ordered by Captain Canada, because he was under the assumption that the hospital command was going to be in charge of the autopsy, which was a natural assumption because Pumphrey's funeral home had a contract with the hospital. When we finished with the autopsies, we would put the bodies in the cold room. Pumphrey's would come, pick those up, take them, and do the cosmetics and actually prepare the body for burial. So I'm sure that Captain Canada just naturally assumed and was trying to be proactive with all of this. But anyway, the body itself came in again around 6:30, 6:38, somewhere like that. The striking thing about it to me was the fact is that the casket the body came in was so plain. It was what we called a shipping casket or a transport casket, and it seemed a little strange to me that the president's body would be placed in something so mundane, so simple. But anyway, it was in a shipping casket. Came in. It was not brought into the morgue proper by Dennis's team, even though, according to Dennis, they unloaded it from a hearse, a black hearse, in the back, and his team brought it to the anteroom, which is where the coal boxes were, and placed it apparently on the floor. It was picked up outside of there, brought into the anteroom, and then brought into the morgue. It was brought in by individuals in dark suits. A couple of flag officers were also accompanying it. Flag officers are actually admirals or generals. It was placed on the floor in the morgue, partially between the two tables. Paul and I started over, but then there were so many people there, and it was such a small place. I stopped. I stayed at the table. Paul went over, took the body, helped remove the body from the casket. They brought it over and put it on the table in front of me. At that time, Dr. Boswell thanked everybody and asked them to leave. At that time, everyone left the morgue. And then Dr. Boswell told Paul and I, don't unwrap the body, don't let anyone in, and he left. And I just naturally assumed that he was going up to the laboratory to talk with Dr. Humes. They were going to come up with a plan, how they were going to do the autopsy. Approximately 15, maybe 20 minutes later, Dr. Boswell returned first. He came into the morgue. He motioned for me to come and help him. We removed the wrappings from the body, not the head. The head remained wrapped. We placed a sheet over the body from his waist down. And then we began to do what we could consider the face sheet. The face sheet was nothing more than a military form that had drawings, the body drawings on it, had places for the weights, measurements. We placed the wounds, the surgical cut downs, old wounds, the back wounds, the appendix scars, and so forth on that sheet. Normally, the people who were assisting, which would have been Paul and myself that night, we would have actually looked for scars and so forth, and the pathologist, if they were involved in it, would write in the results. Okay, this wasn't done that way. Dr. Boswell actually examined the body and dictated to me what to put in there. Now, it's not nefarious that he did that. It was just because I could see what he was doing. I'm sure he just wanted the hands-on, and because the responsibility that he had was great, and he wanted to make sure that he actually accomplished it. But anyway, so we proceeded with that. When we were almost finished with it, Dr. Humes came back in, and he had 4 flag officers following him. At that time, I didn't know who these people were. As they came into the morgue proper from the anteroom, the flag officers went into the gallery, and they came down to the end of the gallery and stood at the rail adjacent to the autopsy table where I was and the body was.
We'll pause here and continue listening to James Jenkins in episode 94. Thank you for listening to episode 93 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK, The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 94, and it's a continuation of episode 93, where we were initially introduced to James Jenkins. Jenkins was one of the 2 autopsy technicians that was present that day at Bethesda and participated in the autopsy. Jenkins is believed to be one of the more credible witnesses to the events that occurred that evening. Well, we're just going to get right back into it, so without further ado, let's listen to episode 94 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
It's not nefarious that he did that. It was just because I could see what he was doing. I'm sure he just wanted the hands-on, and because the responsibility that he had was great, and he wanted to make sure that he actually accomplished it. But anyway, so we proceeded with that. When we were almost finished with it, Dr. Humes came back in, and he had 4 flag officers following him. At that time, I didn't know who these people were. As they came into the morgue proper from the anteroom, the flag officers went into the gallery, and they came down to the end of the gallery and stood at the rail adjacent to the autopsy table where I was and the body was. And then other people began to filter into the gallery, but nobody was allowed on the floor with us. And at that time, Dr. Humes, and I know there was one other person that was with him doing that, and I believe and still do believe that was Dr. Fink. Now, Dr. Fink, in his report to his commanding officer, had said that he didn't arrive in the morgue until after the brain, I believe he stated the brain, the lungs, and the heart were out of the body. But that doesn't seem to be, it's actually suspect for the following reasons. First of all, when the head was unwrapped, then Dr. Humes directed the photographer, who at that time was a corpsman, to take some photographs of the head. And he took heads with a small camera, what I assume was a 35 millimeter. I don't know much about photography, but anyway, it was not a camera with a flash. There were no lights or anything set up for it. But they took a series of photographs, and then we started doing the X-rays. When we started setting up for the X-rays, then the people in the laboratory were again asked to leave because of the radiation involved in it. Portable X-rays at that time were not really well shielded. So the people left, and that included, and I was told to stay, and I was given a lead apron to assist the X-ray technician, and who I was later told was Gerald Custer. We took the first set of X-rays at the direction of Dr. Humes. Now, Dr. Humes didn't point to each thing that he wanted X-rayed. He just told us he wanted laterals, AP, and obliques, and we did a fairly unusual type of X-ray. And the fact is, it wasn't a full chest, and it wasn't a full head. The cassette was placed where it would show the upper part of the chest and upper thorax, and because of the length of it, it actually didn't clear the head. It probably came to about here. It was an unusual type of X-ray to take. At the time, I really didn't think much about it because, I was being directed what I was supposed to be doing, and Paul and I were the lowest people on the totem pole in the whole morgue. So there was no questioning of what we were told to do. And so those X-rays were taken by Gerald Custer to the X-ray department, because at that time we developed X-rays in a tank, that type of thing, and then they were brought back. They were viewed by the pathologist. There were no fragments, no large fragments, no portion bullets, nothing of that nature was found in the X-rays. This didn't seem to go well with the 4 people in the gallery. It was almost like, well, you're not finding what's there or what's supposed to be found. So we were told to repeat the X-rays. Well, when Gerald Custer came back from developing the first set of X-rays, he had an assistant that came with him. Now, I later was told his name was Reed, I believe, right? And they began to repeat the X-rays that Gerald and I had done in the beginning. Those were taken out and developed. Again, no particles, no partial bullets, nothing of that nature. That seemed to increase the tension in the room between the 4 people in the gallery and the pathologist on the floor. So at that point in time, they sent for the radiologist. And Dr. Eversole came in, and he directed the taking of the X-rays by Gerald Custer, and and Reed. Those were taken out, brought back. At the time that they brought those back, they brought in a large bank of X-ray view boxes. We only had 2 small view boxes on the back wall that they were looking at. And they put all of the X-rays up. At that point in time, there were, I think, probably most of the people that were allowed to in the room went back to the back wall to look at the X-rays. I didn't go all the way back there, but from the distance that I could actually see the X-rays. At that time, I really didn't have the experience to read an X-ray. I could tell if it was a broken bone or a cloudy chest, but that was the extent of my abilities. But I did view the X-rays, and the results was still the same. No fragments, no partial bullets, nothing of that nature. I know that I know that there have been reports that there were bullets that fell out on the floor. There were large fragments taken from the behind the ear, things of that nature. I never saw that. If it had occurred, I think the 4 flag officers would have been dancing on the seats. But anyway, that never occurred. After we did the X-rays, Dr. Fink and Dr. Humes began to examine the head. And to a certain extent, Dr. Boswell was involved, but he wasn't in the area of the head. He was across the table from me, and I was looking to my left down on what Humes and Boswell, and then Dr. Boswell was on the other side. But at that time, Dr. Fink actually found a wound in the right temple. It was slightly forward of the ear and a little above it. Dr. Humes and Dr. Fink were discussing this wound. I could see the wound, but it was in the hairline, and the only reason I could see the wound was because Dr. Fink was, they were moving the hair and looking at it, and the wound had gray borders. It wasn't exactly round. It was more of an oblong type thing, and it was about the size of one's tip of the little finger. And Dr. Fink speculated that the graying may be from a bullet. Well, at that point in time, Dr. Humes was called to the gallery to talk to one of the military people. I later was told that was Dr. Berkeley, who was a physician's private, was a private physician for the president. He came back to the table immediately. He told Dr. Fink, we need to get back on the head wound. So they went back to examining the head wound, and the small wound in the right temple was never returned to that night. It was never re-examined. They didn't return to the examination of it. There was never any conclusion as to whether it was actually a wound, whether it was entrance, exit, anything of that nature. After they began examining the head wound, they were examining it. Basically, what had happened was that, we had when the secondary wrap on the head was taken off, the wound had adhered to the wrap. So when it was being taken off, the wound actually kind of separated, and then when the wrapping was removed from are separated from the wound itself and removed. The wound closed up, back up, with the exception of where bone and tissue was missing. And consequently, after that, like I said, we had done preliminary photographs with Dr. Eversole coming in. Mr. Stringer, who was a civilian photographer and actually was in charge of the photography school there, he came in, and then he took over the process of photographing what the doctor's request, and that the photographs were done all through the autopsy itself at different stages at the request of Dr. Fink, Dr. Humes, or Dr. Boswell wanted photographs of this. There were many, many photographs taken, and which today we only see 7, and then there is also a question as to whether those 7 were taken in the morgue that night or whether they were taken somewhere else. It's not something that you can really, I can only allude to it. I have no specific thing other than I know that some of the photographs from the Fox photos do not appear to be taken in the morgue itself for various reasons. Telephone in the wrong place, headrest that I actually did autopsies in that morgue for a little over a year, and I never saw that headrest. None of the other people who were in my class that did autopsies ever saw that headrest, and I'm not sure that the autopsy table where we usually did the autopsies really had the ability to have that headrest mounted on it. So that's actually one of the things that makes me believe that those photographs may or may not be taken in the morgue, the Bethesda morgue, the night that we did the autopsy. There is one autopsy photograph that has the picture of the block, the headrest that we used, which was actually a horned block that you could rotate for different size necks. And we always placed that under the neck because as you were doing the autopsy, and actually we had already seen minor rigor mortis in almost every autopsy that we did. So you wanted to make sure that whenever the rigor mortis set in, that it would not be difficult to be able to position the body normally in the casket when it was prepared. The other thing that we said is that in one of the photographs there is something that we really can't identify. Paul and I both believe that it was some type of, I think Paul described it as an animal cage, but it seemed to be some kind of box that was not present in that morgue. As a matter of fact, in the position that appeared, there was an old Army field X-ray unit that sat there with a sheet over it. We very rarely used it because when we did use it, it radiated everybody that was in the morgue, everybody was in the hallway, anyway, or in the galley that was across the hall. So, as I said, it was more or less used as the last resort when we couldn't get a portable X-ray from the X-ray unit with a technician. Some of the other thing was concerning the telephone. In one of the photographs, there appears to be a telephone on the wall directly adjacent to the table. The telephone in the morgue was actually by the deep sink that just before you go into the hallway where the brain room, the dirty linen room was, and at the end of that short hall, there was a dressing room. That phone, the telephone was memorable because it had a old telephone curly cord on it, but it was so long that it could reach anywhere in the morgue. And so it was, again, unusual and memorable. From there, we progressed. Dr. Humes actually removed the brain, and some of the wound actually spread open and returned. That's significant in two aspects. First of all, to remove the brain, that only had to be extended a short period of time. He also made a coronal suture from that suture down to the tragus, which is this part of the ear. Because of the fracture in the right side of the head, it was extremely malleable. You could move it around with your hand. All we had to do was to separate those two. You could almost fold down the side where he did the incision, and the brain was right there, and it could be removed. As Dr. Humes was removing the brain, he made a statement, kind of an utterance to himself about, well, the damn thing almost fell out of my hand. I didn't think much of it because I assumed that a bullet fragment or something had severed the spinal cord. Consequently, we could remove the brain. Anyway, Dr. Humes removed the brain. He handed it to Dr. Boswell, who was directly across the table from me. Dr. Boswell motioned for me to follow him. We went over to the bucket. The bucket was approximately a 2-gallon stainless steel bucket that we put formalin in. And then we always strung a gauze sling over the bucket where we would take the brain, turn it upside down, lay it in the sling, and we would infuse the brain through the internal carotids, which are the vessels at the base of the brain. We would, by placing needles into the carotids, tying them off, and we had a carboy, which was a 55, well, it's 5-gallon, I guess it was, large glass bottle is what it really was. And it had a system on it where the tubing came down, split in a Y, we put the needles on, and then we would open up the stopcock and allow the formalin to flow into the vascular system of the brain while we were doing the autopsy. At the end of the autopsy, we usually would disconnect that, drop the brain in the bucket, put a lid on it, and place it in the brain room, and to allow it to fix. Once the brain, we went over Dr. Boswell. I had, we had to kneel down. I kneeled down. I don't know, when Dr. Boswell handed me the brain, I turned it upside down and tried to put the needles in. It was unusual in that the internal carotids had retracted, and they were also shriveled a little bit. Now, the retraction's not so unusual. Arteries have musculature to them, and they'll snap back when you cut them. But these were actually retracted as if they had been cut for some time. They had begun to shrivel. I had difficulty getting the needles in because the needles were trying to go through the wall of the vessels. There was one of the residents that was running errands and messages and so forth that had come in to see Dr. Boswell. He saw that I was having problems, and he also tried, was unsuccessful. But eventually, I did get the needles in, get the brain set up for infusion. Dr. Boswell and I went back to the table. At that point in time, they had retracted the scalp away from the wound. You could actually see the true borders, limitations of the wound. And we had began to examine that part of it. At that time, Dr. Boswell signaled to me we were going to and did begin the autopsy of the body proper. Dr. Fink and Dr. Humes continued examining the head at that point in time. You could actually see that when the scalp was reflected back, the fractured bone and so forth that was adhered to the scalp, some of that had fallen away and fallen into the cranium, which actually made the wound appear larger than it actually was. And Dr. Boswell made the incision. We took a striker saw. We cut the breastplate out, of course, and then we removed the organs from the body, placed them on a cutting board. When we started at that time, I placed the cutting board, which was kind of a small table over the president's body. It had a scale on one end of it that we used to weigh the materials that we needed to weigh. And we did a little unusual handling of the organs at Bethesda. We actually took the whole unit of organs out as one unit, placed it, and we dissected the organs and separated them from each other. Then the organs were dissected, examined, and specimens were taken for microscopic exams. Usually the procedure that we had was we would take a specimen from appearing normal section of an organ, and then if we wanted to take a section for somewhere where maybe there was a lesion or a contusion or something of that nature, we would take a section there. That way we had a reference. We did that. We placed those samples in the jars. The normal dissection of the organs, the heart, stomach, liver, was accomplished. We did the normal autopsy in the body proper. During the time that we had the organs out of the body, Dr. Boswell wanted to do the section, the stomach and so forth. I think if this was pretty much into the organ. I mean, the autopsy itself it's too lengthy and to go detail the way that we have at this point. So what I would like to do, I would like to open up the rest of this session to interact with you and answer the questions that I'm sure that you have. Hopefully we can get more information for the short period of time that we have left. And questions? Yes.
Before we open up the questions, how many of you are or were involved in law enforcement?
Well, we only have 10 minutes.
Any? Okay. In my other life, after I got out of the military, I was a New York City detective for 22 years. And in that 22 years of being a detective, I worked in homicide, rape, robbery, burglary, larceny, major crime. And even those of you that work in the medical field and know that when you go down to the morgue and you're dealing with gunshot wounds to the body, to the head, and x-rays are taken, you know there's no such thing as nothing showing up on the x-rays, because any time a projectile enters the body, you know that there's always trace evidence. And it shows up like diamonds. When you take an x-ray, it's like diamonds, because as it enters the body, particles from that projectile will show up on an x-ray. So one of the things that should tell you is that the body was either sanitized and things were removed before it got to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Okay?
Let's go to the questions. We only have 5 minutes. I apologize. We only have approximately 5 minutes left, but we will take as many questions. Yes.
As a pathologist,
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of autopsies.
Okay.
Both as a resident, as faculty, and as a medical examiner. And we do not put the brain in the bucket with the formalin, infused or not infused, before we determine the entrance and the exit.
We, our normal policy was that we did not weigh the brain. It was placed, it was infused. The brain was, once it was infused, and it was infused during the time that we were doing the autopsy, it was put into the bucket at the end of the autopsy. The lid was put on it. It was put in the brain room for the supplemental autopsy. With infusion, we could do that within shorter period of time, 3-4 days, as opposed to the lengthy time it would take by just dropping it in. That was the procedure that we followed at Bethesda. We followed a similar procedure in Philadelphia at a naval hospital there. We actually never infused the brains at the medical center in Mississippi, where I trained, where I did my graduate work. It was just techniques. Now, I understand what you're saying, because I believe that what you're doing is the proper way to do it. But we very rarely actually did a forensic autopsy. My feeling and opinion is that that autopsy was done at Bethesda Hospital because we were military. We could control the information. It could be controlled. Paul and I were given orders by the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, not to discuss this on the penalty of court-martial. And those orders were only rescinded in 1977-76 when we were asked to do a deposition for the House Select Committee. This is the military we're talking about. It's the military. It's the military.
Excuse me.
Sure.
Ma'am,
Yes.
have you ever been in the military?
Pardon?
Okay, let me just explain this to you. I understand, and Jim understands what you're saying.
Let me think. Okay, I'm not arguing with you. In civilian life, we probably would have been classified as deaners, yes.
But this is a medical.
It is, and you know, you have to accept the fact is that that the pathologists that were required and assigned to do this were not forensic pathologists. The only pathology that had any experience in body wounds was Dr. Fink. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Jim was 21 years old in the military at the time, and he was. Let's hear some other questions.
Ladies.
Jim, I have a two-part question.
Sure.
The first is, could you describe the approximate size of the wound you observed at the back of the head? Would it be, for example, as Chuck Crenshaw suggested, about the size of your fist when you double it up?
Something similar to that. I have to say that the wound that I saw, and actually was well defined after the scalp was reflected back from it, was pretty much in agreement with the Parkland doctors.
Part two is this. As David Lifton has emphasized in the official autopsy report of Bethesda, it's a much larger wound. It's virtually the entire back of the head. Can you account for that discrepancy?
I think the statement from it was the entire back of the head is not really. I think that's a perception. The wound itself was approximately 3.5 inches long, 1.5 to 2 inches wide, and it encompassed mostly occipital parietal.
Thank you for listening to episode 94 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK, The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 95. This is the last of 3 episodes in which we listen to James Jenkins as he tells his version of how things went that night at Bethesda, and truly what happened during the autopsy. Testimony of any kind was rare from Jenkins in the early years of assassination research, and remains so even today. Widely seen as one of the more credible witnesses to what happened that night, and one of the few witnesses who actually participated in the autopsy itself. He went on to study for his MD and PhD. This was a reasoned and educated man that was of obvious good character, and he was a man that was not given to hyperbole or exaggeration, even though it seems like that was standard protocol for more than one witness in the story of the JFK assassination. As we conclude the recollections of James Jenkins in this episode 95, I'll quickly move to summarize what James Jenkins said about the 2 caskets and combine that with other evidence as well, and hopefully that summary will tie together for you as a juror the many commentaries that we have wandered in and out of, and where those have indicated a credible indication that the 2 caskets and the 2 ambulances actually existed. To do this, I'll rely heavily on Doug Horn's summation from Volume 4 of his book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. That'll contain a little bit of new information as well, and not just what we've heard thus far. And you'll hear my rendition of it in episode 96. Well, let's get right to it and finish up this 3rd and final episode where we hear from James Jenkins. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 95 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
I have to say that the wound that I saw, and actually was well defined after the scalp was reflected back from it, was pretty much in agreement with the Parkland doctors.
Part two is this. As David Lifton has emphasized in the official autopsy report of Bethesda, it's a much larger wound. It's virtually the entire back of the head. Can you account for that discrepancy?
I think the statement from it was the entire back of the head is not really, I think that's a perception. The wound itself was approximately 3.5 inches long, 1.5 to 2 inches wide, and it encompassed mostly occipital, parietal, and it, again, like I said.
I agree with that, but in the very mathematical, exact depiction in the Bethesda autopsy report, it is enormous. David Lifton has a diagram of the comparison.
Okay.
It's like the difference between the heel of a foot and the whole footprint. It's that enormous.
That is incorrect.
But it's in the
No. What he states in the book is that Dr. Humes described it as 13 centimeters. That's approximately 5 inches. Dr. Boswell described it as 19 millimeters. Now, the discrepancy there is, and this is purely my opinion, is that when the scalp was reflected, bone adhering to the scalp fell away and fell into the cranium, which gave the wound an appearance of being larger than it really was.
Thomas Evan Robinson, who prepared the body for funeral, was present when he said he saw Humes take a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and enlarge the wound. And Reed was with him there at the time. 2 witnesses. The ARRB has their depositions. Were you aware of any of that?
I'm aware that they were incorrect.
No. They witnessed it, Jim, just as you reported what you witnessed.
No. I mean, they probably did witness it, but no. Let me finish this, please. You have a question?
Yes. We get the microphone over here.
Mr. Jenkins, did at any time the people that were conducting the autopsy, Humes or Fink, were they ever being recorded? Did they talk into any kind of recording thing or any stenographers there?
The only notes were the notes that they took. Oh, they were written notes.
Follow-up question to that. Was there a person filming named Bill Pitzer or not? Are you aware of that?
I don't know if Pitzer was actually doing filming or anything of that nature. The only thing that related to the photographs of the body was actually an incident that I wasn't aware of why it occurred, but there was a commotion back in the gallery. Later I was told that one of the Secret Service people had taken a camera away from someone and exposed the film. That's really all I know about that. Yeah, I knew Dennis well. We had a lot of conversations, and he actually told me that.
All right. Since there were 2 arrivals at the hospital, did any of you observe the First Lady in and around the hospital?
I didn't. I was totally in the morgue from 3:30 to the following morning. I know nothing of what happened outside the morgue.
Excuse me. We arrived at the hospital at after 7 p.m. All right? And based on documentation in the log that Dennis David, who was the chief of the day, had logged in, and based on what Jim has already stated the time that he had put down, and understand that The log page was then removed the following morning, okay? But it was after. We did not arrive at Bethesda Naval Hospital until after 7 p.m. And from the time we left Andrews Air Force Base, we shadowed the motorcade in a helicopter, which never stopped. The same door that the First Lady got into, the same door Bobby got into in the ambulance. They exited on the left side, the First Lady, and on the right side, Bobby Kennedy. Okay?
Yeah, let's get this gentleman. He's been trying.
Did you consider that there was any interference to the medical personnel performing the autopsy by others that were not normally part of the autopsy process?
My opinion is that the autopsy was being directed by Dr. Berkeley through Dr. Humes. The comment concerning the surgery was actually Dr. Humes' observation of the wound itself. The wound proper, which is what I consider where the bone and scalp was in. At the top of the wound, there was a jagged incision, or for lack of a better thing, that actually ran forward toward the front of the head. It wasn't exactly parallel to the sagittal suture or the midline. It kind of followed one of the fractures in the skull, and it was really ragged in various places, but it seemed to have been connected with rather neat, clean cuts. It was Dr. Humes asked the gallery, someone in the gallery, if there had been surgery done at Parkland Hospital. He was told that no, it had not been. But it as we worked with the body, that appeared to have been several rents that had been surgically connected because of, as I said, they were neat, clean cuts connecting the rents. And that was actually what caused the wound to fall open when it was being unwrapped and to actually go back in place. No. Now, that's not, again, too, is that you have to understand, this is what I remember. I couldn't possibly have known everything that was going on that night in that morgue. Yes, sir. I've heard that too, but I can't really address it, with any authority. I know that Humes, in some of his testimonies, insisted that he was in charge of the autopsy. And as far as operating the autopsy and so forth, he was the senior pathologist and was responsible for directing, but he was being directed.
Okay, before I let you go,
Sure.
I'm supposed to be giving you guys a break now, but I detect there's an awful lot of interest right now. I don't want to say. That's what I'm going to say. You guys want to keep going? Yeah. Are you guys okay to keep going?
Yeah, that's
keep
fine.
going.
We got water. Okay.
Okay. My name is Bill Ford.
Yeah, Bill.
I'm presenting an autopsy article RFK and JFK on Sunday. But I was a friend of Paul O'Connor, who lived in Gainesville and known him for a number of years. He said, and he said this under oath twice, and other times in the Janesville
in 1993 for the 30th at Santa Fe Community College, showed some of his pictures and x-rays, and said the same thing from the time I knew him, which was probably in the fall of 1993, until he died in 2006. When they took the body out of the shipping casket in the body bag, there was a huge hole in the back of the head and there was no brain. And 2 years ago, in 2016, when you talked about it, you said pretty much the same thing.
No.
Wanted the same thing, that there wasn't much brain except for the palm of your hand.
No, that's a mistake.
There was no brain, and all the brain was there, fit the palm of your hand.
Okay, let me adjust. I have never, from the very beginning, Paul said that there was a large gaping hole. Now, I can see where he would have saw it, because the wound had a huge amount of tissue, matted hair, blood, and so forth. Until the reflection of the scalp, it was extremely difficult to actually identify the borders of it. It just seemed to be a big mass there. As I explained, when the wrappings were taken off, they adhered to the head because of the serum, dried blood, and so forth, which caused the wound to gape open. Now, the brain that we had at autopsy did not have damage that you would expect by comparing it to the damage that was to the skull, to the head itself. There were other anomalies considering the brain. The brain, the convolutions on the brain, the gyri, sulci, they were abnormal. They didn't look like the normal brains that we had taken at autopsy. The gyri were flat, seemed to be larger. The color, instead of the gray that we normally saw, had a white sheen to it. Now, tomorrow, I guess, I have worked with Dr. Mike Chesser for several years. In not 19, but in 2015, Mike had approached me about the brain that he had actually seen the photographs in the archives. He believed at that point in time that the brain had been in his statement is that it had been in a jar with other brains and fixatives. That would really account for the appearance of the brain, as you can probably attest to. Yes. Pardon?
What happened to the brain after you put it in the jar and put it in the brain room?
It was in the bucket. I don't know what happened to the brain, because when Paul and I went back to the morgue after we were given the orders to make sure that we had finished everything that was necessary, the morgue log was gone. The casket that was pushed up against the coal boxes was gone. Actually, it was gone before we left the morgue. And the brain bucket was gone.
We're going to have everybody who wants to ask a question come over here so everybody can hear.
Okay.
So if you want to ask a question, come up here, please.
Okay. Just before Paul O'Connor told me the same thing in Florida about the brain was gone practically.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's what he told me personally. Same thing as that gentleman said. Now, here's the question. You said there was quite a big missing part of the head back here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what about up here? What did you see there?
I did not see anything there.
Nothing there. Okay.
No.
So the Zapruder film that shows this thing, you think was fake?
Not really. I think what the Zapruder, there was a flap on the side of the head that in one of the photographs is actually extended out. I think, in my opinion, that flap was actually fractured, skull and so forth, prior to Dr. Humes making the coronal incision in order to remove the brain, which freed that up to allow it to be flexible to move out in and out.
In the Zapruder film, though, it shows the flap going like this.
It's
like this going this way and that going that. I mean, that's in the Zapruder film.
I'm not sure. That's my interpretation.
Did you see the Zapruder film?
Yeah, I have, and my interpretation was, or what I assumed was, that it was the flap that was separated, but it actually went back, because when the body we first saw the body, the flap was not. I didn't see the flap there.
Okay.
And it wasn't until, actually, to be honest with you, I never saw the flap in that position that is shown in the photograph.
Okay.
And let me address the thing of brain and no brain. I believe Paul. I believe the two people. But I also believe that even though they were sincere in what they said, I think it was more or less a shock effect in their perception. Now, I guess I will go on record as saying this. I do not believe, personally, that the brain that we took at autopsy was the president's brain.
Whoa.
Okay. And I also would like to explain why. First of all, the brain had an unusual appearance. When I first talked to David Lifton, I told Harry Livingston the same thing. The first thing that flashed through my mind, and this was through my mind, was this, a female brain. Now, out of all of the studies that I have participated in the graduate programs that I was in, I searched to see if there was a difference. I never found anything. So it wasn't until I talked to Dr. Chester, who is a neurologist and very much into this, that a possible explanation for that was presented to me. And when he told me that he felt like that the brain appearance was the appearance of a brain that had been infixative along with other brains for a period of time, which caused the flat area. He also said the brain was very asymmetrical. That was the first time that I had a logical explanation for what I saw. I based that, and the fact is that I now do not believe that was the president's brain. Second is, in the autopsy, the official autopsy report, the extensive damage that's reported in that report in the secondary or the supplemental autopsy, which is specifically autopsy of the brain after it's fixed, was not the brain that we took at autopsy was not that extensively damaged. because if it had been damaged as extensively as was reported in the autopsy with such fine detail, then there would have been no reason to infuse that brain, because what would have occurred, the formula would just run out because there was damage to the superior sagittal canal, for better, and that's the collection point for basically the vascular system in the body. We would have been just as well off dropping it in the bucket. We would have had, because there would have been a vast amount of internal tissue and so forth that would have been exposed directly to the formula. So those are the two things that I use for myself to say that at this point in time, I do not believe that the brain that we took at autopsy was that of the president. I do believe that the supplemental autopsy, and I agree with Doug Horn, there were actually two supplemental autopsies on separate, each on separate brains. We know that from testimony that was the Record Review Board, that Dr. Boswell, Dr. Humes, and Mr. Stringer attended one. Mr. Stringer says that he did coronal sutures, placed them on a viewing plate, and took photographs. There was also one, Dr. Boswell, Dr. Humes, Dr. Fink, and an unknown photographer attended. And Dr. Humes, in his supplemental autopsy, described a vast amount of damage to the brain. I mean, extreme amount of damage to the brain. But he also said that in a supplemental autopsy, they didn't do sections in order to preserve the brain in total. So those are two contradictory reports on two separate or actually brain autopsies, which are supplemental autopsies. Okay. Thank you.
Jim, I've been lucky enough to have lunch with you and Hubie, but my question would be, and I'm not disputing you at all.
Well,
but
I understand. There is, in the book, I did not avoid these controversies. I actually put them in because I want you, the reader, to make your own determinations about this. You know, it's a lot of it is perplexing to me also. There were with Hubie, when I first met them, and they found out that when they brought the casket in, we were already proceeding with the autopsy. It was, you know, it was shocking to them, but they provided valuable information to clarify some of the gray memories that I had, or partial memories that I had of a casket being brought in other than the one that the president was in. So that was the one that was pushed up against the coal boxes.
my question, Jim, is,
Sure.
again, I'm not disputing you,
Yeah.
but when you just testified that there were no bullet fragments or anything that you saw on X-ray, my question is, I also knew Dennis David, as you guys all do,
Mm-hmm.
and Dennis David supposedly had metal fragments that he admitted into evidence that was later taken out, just as the same as it was with the timing of the log taken out the following day. So where were those metal fragments from?
The metal fragments were brought into the morgue somewhere late in the autopsy. They were in it's similar to a Ziploc bag, except it has a twist tie on it. In a small bag, there were metal fragments, and they were also bone fragments. They were small. They were measured in millimeters. And those fragments, during the autopsy, Dr. Humes, Dr. Fink, tried to fit those into some of the niches that were in the wound itself. Was not very successful. There were no, or well, I'll say I saw no medium-sized or large bone fragments in the morgue, with the exception of those. Dennis, actually, those metal fragments that Dennis brought in were the ones that were brought in and placed at the right ear of the president on the table, and were later there was an attempt to see if they fit within the structure. Those are the fragments that Dennis has talked about.
Well, maybe.
Well, I can only assume that. I mean, from the description that Dennis gave me and so forth, and from what I saw, I can only assume that those were the same fragments. Those fragments were given to Jim Seibert, one of the FBI agents, and they took them to the lab.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering if any of you gentlemen have any insights or observations about Lieutenant Commander Pitzer and his subsequent murder?
Well, if you go back and you read the reports on Pitzer, they came to the conclusion that he committed suicide. So we don't.
Move closer.
The reports all suggest that he committed suicide. However, Dennis David, to the end of his days, was convinced that Bill Pitzer did not commit suicide, and it was because he had film of the autopsy that Dennis said that he looked at one day, 3 days after the autopsy, that Bill was running through a hand crank machine. And so we just don't know. That's part of the bigger mystery.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service.
I'd like to say something about Pitzer.
Yes, please.
All right. You can. There are some incidents I'd like to explain. In the pathology, well, I'll put it this way. There is a report. They did a paraffin test on the hand. Now, they couldn't, you know why they couldn't use the paraffin test? Because there was too much flesh, blood, and hair enmeshed in it. In other words, the hand had been damaged severely, so they couldn't use it. I mean, you pull out that paraffin and you've got macerated flesh and it pulls it off. That's not a normal hand. Now, the widow wanted to get the wedding band and sent a relative to get it, and we have a report that, according to Mr. Eaglesham, whose work I do not accept, he said the relative went over there and forgot to go and get the wedding band and came back and made up the story that the man's hand was totally messed up so they couldn't get it off, as if a relative would tell a widow such a thing, such a horrible thing. On the other hand, Mr. Eaglesham has autopsy photos showing both hands looking just fine, but you cannot see them unless you get an appointment. All right? I've examined Mr. Eaglesham's work. He is a former biochemist who somehow thinks it's more profitable for him to these days to write freelance writing for people. And I wonder for whom. So we don't get along very well. And I do not believe that Commander Pitzer committed suicide and also chewed up his hand first. Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. This is my first conference. I'm new to the Kennedy deal, relatively new. Question for Jim. Earlier you mentioned that you thought maybe Admiral Berkeley, who was Kennedy's private physician, was leading the autopsy in some way. Do you believe that he was pro-Kennedy, or was he complicit in this in some way?
I don't really know. I think that he was directing the autopsy, following directions from the Kennedy family and probably from Bobby Kennedy. There was a reluctance when we first began the autopsy. We were only going to do the head and upper thorax. When there were no fragments found in the x-rays, Dr. Fink and Dr. Humes almost insisted that we do a full body x-ray because, as the lady, Dr. Here knows, in forensics, the bullet can be anywhere. So we actually started the full body autopsy before we had permission to do it at Dr. Humes and Dr. Fink's insistence.
Just in support of the other brain, I was reading in the last year, it was the X-ray, the man who, I don't know if it was Stringer or the other man, but the underneath photo in the National Archives, he said he never took that. There was never an underneath, and I don't know what the word is for that, but it was an interesting word.
Yeah, Mr. Stringer actually said that he never took any photographs of the underside of the brain, the basal side. And yet the photographs in the archives, now Dr. David Mantic and Dr. Michael Chesser have both been allowed in to the archives. I have made 2 attempts to get permission. I've been denied both times. First thing to the Kennedy lawyer that controls the deed of gift. I do not meet the criteria. The criteria is quite high. You do have to be a physician, and you have to be a well-written, known physician. And even at that point in time, there's always an if factor involved in it. And like with Dr. Chesser, who is a neurologist, teaching neurologist, well known in his field in the area where he practices at University, actually Baptist Hospital in Little Rock. He's involved with the university there. He had requested, and he actually had to submit his request several times before he was allowed in to view the x-rays and the photographs. Dr. Mantic, of course, has been in a few times. I think he's been in 9 times, but that was in the early years. I think, and I think the last conversation I had with he and Dr. Chesser that he had requested permission but had been denied recently. It's an extremely frustrating thing to be asked questions about the photographs and so forth, and not be able to view the original photographs that are in the archives. This, like I said, this is a situation. Dr. Mantic and Dr. Chesser have both tried to get me into the archives. I requested permission from my local congressman. He was unable to actually get permission for me to go into the x-rays. This is not an unusual type of situation. I wanted to return to Bethesda to verify or answer some questions about the morgue, its present location, what had occurred, and things of that nature. We weren't able to do that too. Yeah, but we were unable to do that also. This is one of the situations that the researchers run up against. These things are sequestered. Paul and I were never called to actually testify before any of the government inquiries. We were only required to give a deposition for the House Select Committee, which turned out to be a fiasco. The Record Review Board, they were not allowed to contact us. So and then after the House Select Committee, supposedly all of the records, or most of the records, were to be released to the public, with the exception of mine and Paul's, which was put into another 50-year sequestration. Was only released because of, I'm not sure what the act is called, but the act established the Record Review Board. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Please show me with your hands on your own head where the entrance wound for the large exit wound and where the large exit wound were exactly.
I can show you where the wound is. The wound is approximately in this area.
Okay.
In the occipital, parietal, and as I described earlier, there was more of a fracture line than anything that formed a tail that came down and touched on to the temporal area here. The wound here was a small wound that I can only tell you what I left the morgue thinking or feeling, that I had seen two actual wounds. During the autopsy, we were told that the throat wound was actually an emergency tracheotomy and not to bother with it. That was the wound that Dr. Perry said he did the tracheotomy over. I went home the following morning thinking that the president had been shot from the right front with an exit wound in the back of posterior portion of the head, and that he had also been shot in the back, primarily between the shoulder blade, which is the scapula, at the top of the scapula, halfway between that and I think that's T3, T2, which is the vertebra there. That wound was probed. When it was probed, it actually went downward at approximately a 30-degree angle, and the depth of it was, Dr. Humes could probe the depth of it with his little finger. Now, Dr. Humes had large hands, but he could actually probe the depth of that wound with his little finger. They began to probe it with a metal probe, which was basically a flat probe on one end. It went to kind of a bald point on the other end. Dr. Fink expressed his concern that they may create a false entry into the pleural cavity, and they went to a sound. A sound is a type of probe. It's almost like a metal catheter. It's rounded on one end. I was hesitant to kind of melt those together because I wasn't sure. The information that I received from Hubie and the others gave me the ability to at least believe that the caskets, the particular casket was the Dallas casket. And this is the situation. Let me take some more questions then.
Yeah, Jim, just a quick two-part question relates to what you're saying now. Were you allowed to review over your deposition from the House Select Committee? And if you were not, at the time that you did it, were you given a chance to review over it and sign it before they put it away for 50 years?
No. Actually, I never saw the deposition until really the Record Review Board. And then someone sent me a copy of it. There were a lot of it that totally made no sense. And then it seemed the whole process was argumentative. And it was a process where they would ask me a question, I would tell them, and they would tell me, well, that can't be right because so-and-so said this. And quite frankly, toward the end of the interview, I terminated the interview and went back to the graduate school where I went back to my office. At the very beginning, I was contacted and told that these two people would show up at my home on such and such date. They wanted to discuss my participation in the JFK. I told them at that time I really wasn't interested in getting involved in that or reliving it. Then I was told that was a mandate from Congress to establish the House Select Committee and that I was required to do that. At that time, I said, okay. And actually, I found out through local representative, our Senator Thad Cochran, his office actually called to verify that it was a federally mandated committee, so forth. And then he suggested that I meet with him in his office, which we did.
Thanks, Jim.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we've got to wrap it up. These gentlemen have been speaking for over 2 hours. If you would, a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Come on, we can really give them a lot more than that. They give a lot to us.
Thank you for listening to episode 95 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.